Okay, I'd like to highlight the board. Currently, we have 3 vacancies. We're actively looking for 2 public members and a specialty contractor. The budget is $70 million. However, we have fixed costs that must be paid, and they include into the pension fund. We had an assessment for that last year, and those fixed costs came to approximately $8 million, so that meant we had a budget really of $78 million. We spent out of that, we only spent $70 million of our $75 million allocated budget, but we had the $8 million in fixed costs, which rose to $78 million. The good news is we brought in approximately $81 million, so we did have a little surplus. Our staff size in California is 425 allocated positions. We're hovering just a little bit over a 10% vacancy rate. I don't know how it is in Nevada, but we seem to find it more challenging today than we did a year ago to find qualified staff, but we are actively recruiting. Good news, our licensees are up about 4,000 in the last 12 months, so that's a positive trend. We want to keep going, keep going forward, and we believe that will happen because we look at our new applications. If we look at last fiscal year, which ended June 31st, to the prior fiscal year, we received 20,876 original applications, and that's a 61% increase year over year. So it's a very positive trend for us. Regarding the PSI test centers, we made the transition July of this year, so it's recent that the transition occurred. At the meeting yesterday, we heard from industry leaders that there has been some difficulties. One is we've had applicants that have had to return to the test center on multiple occasions. One day to take the trade exam, maybe they have to return and take the law and business at a later date. That can pose a hardship. Plus, as Board Member Simpson was alluding to, at this time we don't have the ability for our applicants to take the exam outside of California. It's something we definitely want to look at. I discussed this with Margie Green last night, and she's familiar with an executive with PSI and mentioned that he will likely be at a meeting that we'll be attending this afternoon. So she offered to open the door and we can have a conversation and find out what it will take for California to have our exams administered in other states. So I'll be reporting back to the board on that. As far as renewal applications, they're up 2%. So again, positive. Circling back to the licensees, you'll notice that the inactive decreased, and we think part of that is because the inactive licensees are not renewing to the extent they once did. And so one thought we have is to survey those that have not renewed their inactive license to find out why, or even to find out why they've gone inactive, and see if there's something that we could do to encourage them to keep their license current. Surety bond in California, the surety bond is $15,000. The California board sponsored legislation to raise the surety bond to $25,000. That'll be effective January 1st, 2023. In workers' comp, similar to Nevada, you have to either have a workers' compensation insurance policy, but in California, I'm not sure how Nevada is, but in California, you can have an exemption today where you certify that you don't have employees. Now, we found that 55% of our licensees are filing that document saying they don't have employees, where a lot of them actually do have employees, and perhaps most of them do. And so the California board sponsored legislation to require all licensees to have a workers' compensation insurance policy. And that bill is currently on the governor's desk. And if signed, as of January of 2023, concrete, tree service, asbestos abatement, and HVAC contractors will be required to have workers' compensation insurance. By 2026, all California licensees will be required to have a workers' compensation insurance policy. Moving on to the number of complaints, we've talked a little bit about solar, and we're seeing that our solar complaints are increasing fairly dramatically. For the last 4 years, we received approximately 90 a month. Our goal was to bring that number down. Instead, we've increased the complaints being received, and we're now receiving approximately 130 a month. And they differ as to the complexity and how egregious they are, but it's still something that we need to keep an eye on. Overall, we're receiving approximately 1,200 consumer complaints a month, and 20% of those are filed against unlicensed contractors. 1,200 is about 200 more than we have received monthly for the prior 2 years. So we're having to keep a real close eye on our resources to make sure we can handle that additional workload. As far as the recovery fund, we have a recovery fund for solar only, and it's only for residential solar. We modeled that legislation after the Nevada Board's recovery fund, so I want to thank you for all the help that you did in helping us put that legislative proposal together. It's very similar to your recovery fund in that it caps at $40,000. First 12 months having the fund, we were able to disperse approximately $1.4 million. It's a fixed allocation of $5 million, $4 million for restitution, $1 million to administer the fund. There'll be a public meeting we anticipate having a public meeting in November with the privately owned utilities to see if there's a need to continue a solar fund into the future. And with that, I guess the last thing is we were able to revoke, we unfortunately had to revoke 446 licenses, but that does remain a real priority here in California to identify the egregious contractors, those that don't belong in the marketplace, and if they are licensed, to revoke that license in a timely manner. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions.
What do you think the spike is with all the applications coming in? You think it has something to do with the 2 years of COVID that everyone went through, or just that big surge?
Yeah, I think it's a pin-up demand. They remain a lot of construction going on in California. I'd like to think that our outreach, the information that we're giving out in our public meetings is helping, and that I think people understand that construction is a viable career opportunity. And so to meet the need, we need more contractors in California. I know that Margie had mentioned that I believe the population of Nevada has grown by about 1 million, and yet the licensed population hasn't kept up. It's very similar in California. And we have approximately 40 million Californians, and we only have about 245,000 licensed contractors. And one thing we hear a lot about in California is that it can be hard to find a contractor, and if you need something done, you have to get on a waiting list. So I hope that's why, but it's something positive. I hope it continues.
Any other board comments?
Yes, what the answer was. CSLB is entirely self-funding. We are within the structure of DCA, Department of Consumer Affairs, but we rely on our fees and programs. Can you describe how you fit within the structure of Nevada?
Thank you for the question. Yes, in Nevada, we are what we would call a standalone board. We're entirely self-funded. We are, of course, regulated by the state, but all of our funds remain with the board. Our budget is approved by the board. It does not we're not part of the general fund. Our employees are not state employees, they're board employees. So we have our own pension plan, our own benefit program. So in that sense, we operate similar to a private entity, but we are state regulated.
Thank you.
Any other board questions or comments? Any public questions or comments? Okay, I will turn it over to Chair Martin.
Thank you. We're going to move to item C4 because of time constraints on one of the presenters. I want to accommodate those. The item C4 is a discussion concerning partnering with state agencies. This discussion will be led by Executive Officer Green, followed by California Board Member Miguel Galarza, who will provide information on California task forces.
Thank you, Chair Martin. With regard to Nevada activities, we have a task force on employee misclassification, which was created during the 2019 Nevada legislative session. I currently serve as one of the 8 members on the task force appointed by the governor. 4 meetings were held during 2021-22. The task force continued to review current laws and regulations governing misclassification and independent contractors, and heard presentations from the Nevada Labor Commissioner, Nevada Department of Employment and Training and Rehab, the Nevada State Contractors Board, and the U.S. Department of Labor. Our year-end annual report of the task force contained recommendations for consideration by the Nevada 2023 legislature, which include in part modifying statutes or regulations that limit the sharing of investigative information relating to misclassification between agencies, and to clarify, there are some laws on the books that do not allow agencies to share information, so we're trying to change that. Also, we're trying to create a standard definition of misclassification, and then another recommendation might be the possible sunsetting of the task force and instead creating working groups that could meet regularly to share information on misclassification cases. Also, we have the Nevada Interagency Task Force. This task force was recently created to create procedures for participants to communicate regarding illegal and fraudulent contracting activity and the underground economy. Members of our task force include building officials, the Attorney General's Workers' Comp Fraud Unit, DIR, OSHA, law enforcement, district attorney's offices, the Labor Commissioner, Department of Business and Industry, and industry stakeholders. The task force meets in Northern and Southern Nevada quarterly. Some of the ideas we are discussing are modifying the owner-builder affidavit and an ongoing public education program regarding owner-builders, proposing legislation to address house flipping, reestablishing the dedicated construction theft unit with Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department, expanding our PR campaign concerning building permit requirements, and establishing a direct contact from each participating agency to expedite the process of notification of fraudulent activities in the construction industry, and developing an app where the public can report information to the task force, and also increasing our multi-agency sweeps. Yes.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Ms. Green? Seeing none, we'll ask Board Member Galarza.
Thank you, Chair Chair Tigert and Register folk for allowing me to jump the line as I have pressing engagement in San Francisco. So thank you for that. We'll now go ahead and read the agenda items C4A and C4B regarding our joint efforts. This information regarding CSLB partnering and state agencies can be found in the beginning on page 26 of your board packet. CSLB Enforcement Division participates in two joint agency, multi-agency task force, the Joint Enforcement Task Force, or JESF, and the Labor Enforcement Task Force, which does not have a cool acronym, so will be known as ELTF. Both the goals and memberships of these task force overlap, and I will discuss each group in turn. The Joint Enforcement Task Force, or JESF, was created in 1993 and was placed into the state statute in 1995. The goal of JESF are to combat the underground economy in California and level the playing field for law-abiding businesses. The JESF partners are California agencies which handle taxation, wage administration, workplace safety, licensing, and enforcement. JESF is chaired by the California Employment Development Department, or EDD, and there are 14 member agencies in JESF, including CSLB, EDD, the Department of Occupational Safety and Health, the Division of Labor Standards and Enforcement, the Franchise Tax Board, Department of Insurance, and the Department of Justice, and others. Memorandums of Understanding, or MOUs, between partner agencies clarify each agency's roles and responsibilities. The MOUs, including the methods of information sharing, including tax, wages, and safety records. This is one of the key reasons that the multi-agency partnerships work well, is the sharing of this information. The MOUs between EDD and CSLB require joint sweep operations to be conducted monthly. There are 8 teams across the state, which do 2 sweeps a day per month, for a total of 192 annual sweep days. In 2021, Joseph enforced efforts resulted in the suspension of 221 licenses for over a recovery of $34 million in outstanding taxes and liabilities. The recovery of those was $18 million in outstanding taxes, fees, and penalties to these aligned state agencies. The Labor Enforcement Task Force, or ELTF, was created in 2005 as the Economic and Employment Enforcement Coalition. The group was renamed the Labor Enforcement Task Force in 2012. Like Joseph, ELTF targets the underground economy in California. ELTF established goals are to ensure that workers receive proper wages, ensure employees are provided with a safe working environment, ensure that California receives all the proper taxes, fees, and penalties due from employers, and also to eliminate unfair business practices and competition, make efficient use of state resources and accompanying these goals. ELTF is chaired by the California Department of Industrial Relations, or otherwise known as DIR. There are 9 member agencies in ELTF, including CSLB, the Employment Development Department, DIR, the Division of Labor Standards and Enforcement, the Division of Occupational Safety and Health, and others. Working as a team, ELTF members inspect active job sites to verify compliance with state laws and regulations regarding employee wages, licensing, insurance requirements, taxes, and workplace safety. ELTF targets construction sites with multiple trades and multiple employees when they are present. Team members are also on the lookout for violations such as cash wage payments, employees, unsafe work conditions, and unregistered or unlicensed employers. In 2021, ELTF inspection team checked 88 contractors on active construction sites, and unfortunately found, or fortunately found, 66 of these 88, or 75%, out of compliance with one or more state regulations and requirements, resulting in an opening of 65 investigations at CSLB, issuing 14 stop orders requiring the immediate cessation of work, referring 46 businesses for tax audits by EDD, and found 15 serious workplace violations and safety violations. I myself can attest, as a public works contractor and a member of AGC and United Contractors, that these efforts from JESF and CETF are working. There are a lot of contractors that are used to residential work that are entering the public works arena, and all are aware of all the rules and regulations. And through the efforts of education, they're recognizing that there are labor standards, DIR standards, OSHA standards, and so it is a different paradigm for them to enter into the workforce in the public works arena. And so through these efforts, they're coming to terms with those and recognizing maybe public works is not for them. But either way, these enforcement actions are important to make sure that public works contractors and all contractors are treated fairly and are on the same playing field. As contractors enter into the market, JESF and ELTF remind them that it's not a free-for-all, that there are rules and regulations that need to be adhered to. So with that, CSLB staff is efficient in combating unlicensed and unsecured and uninsured activities. However, additional assistance is needed to address other underground economy violations. The sharing information resources through JESF and ELTF joint inspections to address tax, workplace safety, and wage violations are a powerful tool for combating the underground economy. CSLB has found its membership in both groups to be extremely valuable. Thank you very much. Are there any questions from the board? Are there any questions from the public? Hearing and seeing none. Thank you, and I bid you all adieu. Safe travels.
Thank you, Board Member Galarza and Executive Officer Green. At this time, we'll take a 10-minute recess, and there's coffee and water in the back, and we'll come back in 10 minutes. Thank you.
Welcome back. We will go ahead and resume our agenda with what was formerly known as the third item, which is combating Nevada's and California's underground economy. So we will be discussing unlicensed activity, workers' compensation enforcement, permit avoidance, and house flipping. Each of these items will be taken individually, with CSLB presenting, followed by Nevada, and then board member discussion of each item. California Chief of Enforcement Steve Grove will open by providing an update on efforts to address unlicensed and uninsured activity. And then California Board Member Steve Pinelli, who serves as the building official on the board, will discuss permit avoidance and house flipping. Chief Martin, would you like to identify the Nevada representatives for these agenda items?
Yes, thank you. On item C3A, the discussion concerning unlicensed activity, Paul Rosario, Director of Investigations, will be presenting this morning. On item 3B, discussion concerning workers' compensation enforcement, Paul Rosario will present. On item 3C, discussion concerning permit avoidance, Sam Palmer, Deputy Executive Officer, will report on this agenda item. And on item C3D, discussion concerning house flipping, Board Member Joe Hernandez will report. Thank you.
So we'll start off with Steve Grove. You are up.
Good morning, thank you. I'm going to give a brief overview of what unlicensed contracting is here in California. Any project valued at $500 or more, material and labor, which is pretty much anything these days, requires a contractor's license. We can charge unlicensed contractors administratively or criminally when we catch them performing these acts. Administrative citations have civil penalties up to $30,000. So consumers can be victimized by unlicensed contractors in many ways. Abandonment of the project, substandard workmanship, failure to pull permits, which then leads to no inspections by building inspectors. Sometimes outright theft, where they take money and do no work at all, never had any intention of doing work. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of help that we can provide to a consumer who's been victimized by an unlicensed contractor, which is why we really emphasize hiring only licensed contractors and preventing this from happening in the first place. When a consumer is financially injured due to an unlicensed contractor, one recourse is Business and Professions Code 7031, which allows a consumer through a civil action to recoup all money paid to an unlicensed contractor. But this is not something that the Contractors Board has any authority to enforce. They have to take it to small claims court or get an attorney and pursue a civil case. So the goal for CSLB enforcement is to prevent unlicensed contracting in the first place. And we do this through education, outreach, and then deterrence from our enforcement actions. So there's many benefits to hiring a licensed contractor. Licensed contractors have taken and passed complex licensing and our law and trade exams. They've also documented 4 years of journey level experience in the trade that they're licensed in. They're required to maintain a bond of $15,000 that a consumer can file a claim against if they have an issue. They also undergo criminal background checks. In the event that a project ends or results in a consumer filed complaint, there's a lot that we can do at the CSLB to assist the consumer. The first thing is we have consumer services representatives in our intake mediation centers who are very good at working out a settlement. They contact the contractor and the consumer, and they try to work out their differences and resolve it at an informal level. If that process is unsuccessful, the complaint will be referred to a field investigator. And one of the first things we do if there's workmanship violations is we send out an industry expert. The board pays for a licensed contractor who's in the same classification as the workmanship items to provide us a report on what it would cost to complete or correct the workmanship issues. That report then is sometimes used by the investigator to resolve the complaint right there. We can sometimes get the contractor to just write a check and pay the consumer for that financial injury and avoid a legal action. If that's not possible, we have CSLB-sponsored arbitration where we pay for the case to go to an arbitrator, and we can get judgments up to $50,000 to the consumer or the contractor, whoever prevails. So the question, why do so many consumers hire unlicensed contractors? Oh, go ahead, Dave.
Steve, if I could you maybe focus on what you do in enforcement to address those that are on proactive enforcement? Maybe talk a little bit about job site inspections and undercover operations
Okay,
here. Yeah.
sure. To our SWIFT unit, who their primary focus is to go out and look for unlicensed contractors. So we do this, we have a three-prong approach. We receive leads from consumers or the public at large, licensed contractors reporting an active job site with potential unlicensed contractors. And we'll do everything we can to send an investigator out to that job site and try to catch the contractor in the act. It's a bit challenging with 27 investigators covering 58 counties. The other thing that we do is we do sweeps. And we do sweeps among just our own staff and also, as was discussed earlier, with the Joint Enforcement Strike Force and the Labor Enforcement Task Force. And we do these sweep operations all through the year. And then the final effort that we do are our undercover sting operations. And we usually average about 80 sting operations per year pre-COVID. But unfortunately, since COVID, we've been having a lot of difficulty getting people to let us use their properties. We can't do a sting unless we have either a residential or a commercial property to use to do that sting. Okay. So the question that we're asking right now in enforcement is just how big is the underground economy? And most of us realize that California has one of the largest economies in the world, and construction is the #1 industry in California. And staff recently conducted a random survey of online advertising for construction work, and we found that out of 180 construction advertisements, like on Craigslist and other formats, 78% did not include a license number or state that the contractor is unlicensed as required by the law. So it's highly likely that all of those ads were from unlicensed contractors. So what are we doing about it? Every year, CSLB investigates thousands of consumer complaints involving unlicensed contractors. About 20% of the complaints that come in are regarding unlicensed contractors. And then I already talked about what the SWIFT unit does with the proactive, a little bit of stats on that. In 2021, CSLB referred 208 criminal complaints for contracting illegally to local prosecutors and issued 700 administrative citations, resulting in $1.7 million in civil penalties collected. The SWIFT unit conducted 18 sting operations and participated in 160 sweeps and responded to over 900 leads. And again, these numbers are way lower than what they were pre-COVID. So we're really hoping to get those numbers back up in the next year or two. So our current strategies for combating illegal contracting include increasing our proactive enforcement to return to pre-COVID levels. And additionally, as previously discussed yesterday, we're requesting approval to hire a consultant to assess the size of the underground economy and the current allocation of enforcement resources. With that, I'll take any questions or.
I had a question for you. From the, sir,
Oh,
over here.
okay, sorry.
Brian with the Nevada Contractors Board. I just had a question. We run into this a lot, I feel, in Nevada, and I was curious, how do you do the conversion? If you have someone who's unlicensed, how do you incentivize them and bring them over to get them licensed if they're willing and they're open to it? We run into that a lot where I think there's an intimidation factor and they just don't know how to do it, and one thing I run into out there all the time is just trying to bring them to the board, to get them to talk to the staff and not be intimidated by that. How do you guys handle it?
Okay, well, one thing that we do is our SWIFT investigators have a application package. We keep them in the cars. So when we go out on a lead or we do a sweep and, or especially at the sting operations, even though we're arresting somebody and issuing them an NTA to appear in court, at the same time we hand them a package with everything to apply for a contractor's license.
Thank you, sir.
Yep.
Any other questions from the board? Any questions from the public?
Sorry for shedding. Some of your research, how many of your complaints are due to a poorly written contract with the consumer,
For unlicensed contracting,
either licensed or unlicensed?
And Steve, do you mind repeating the question? Can't quite hear it.
so the question was, how many of our complaints have something to do with a poorly written contract?
Correct, yes.
Well, the law section that covers all the language that's required to be in a contract, 7159, is very complex and it's very long, and there's a high percentage of complaints that come in are not in compliance with that law section. Yes.
So you would say that a high percentage of the complaints are due to a poorly written contract, is that correct?
Well, that's, a lot of times the complaints are written, are submitted because poor work or abandonment or a dispute over a change order or a verbal change order or something like that. But we almost always find that the contract is not in compliance with the law. Yeah.
Repeat it.
Yeah, we're working on making sure we understand all the people who've asked questions. So going forward, if anyone else would like to ask a question, we'd invite you up to the podium. Are there any other public questions? Okay. With that, Mr. Rosario, can we hear from you?
Good morning. Paul Rosario with the Nevada State Contractors Board, Director of Investigations. I appreciate the opportunity to come address both boards this morning. The use of unlicensed contractor places the homeowner at financial risk for worker injury claims, unpermitted work, poor workmanship, and/or abandoned projects. Nevada continues to have a significant problem with unlicensed contractors operating in the state in both residential and commercial projects. During the past fiscal year, which was July 21 through June of 22, the Nscb referred 50 unlicensed contractor cases to local district attorneys for criminal prosecution and issued 230 administrative citations to unlicensed contractors. In total, the administrative citations resulted in over $632,000 in fines and costs. Also during the fiscal year, the Nscb issued 287 cease and desist orders to unlicensed contractors. Again, during the fiscal year, complaints against unlicensed contractors in the state totaled 718, or approximately 34% of consumer complaints filed with the board. Several investigations over the past year indicate a closer working relationship between some licensed contractors and unlicensed contractors than seen in previous years, which is very concerning to the board. There is speculation that the high demand for labor that has resulted in licensed contractors subcontracting to unlicensed contractors in order to meet their construction timelines and manage construction costs. Investigations has also initiated more cases in which licensed contractors allow their licenses for a fee to be utilized by unlicensed contractors for the pulling of permits. The Nscb recent strategies for combating the underground economy, unlicensed contracting, include soliciting the construction industry and building departments to report suspected unlicensed contracting activities. This is a force multiplier, and as the construction industry is the best situated to identify and report any unlicensed contracting. With an estimated over 100,000 construction workers in Nevada, there exists a force multiplier in the number of people in the construction field who can assist the board. State and local inspector jobs, duties, whether it's a building department or from city planning of job sites, allows them the opportunity to identify suspicious unlicensed activities. Though a permit is issued to licensed contractor, there may be instances in which a general contractor or prime contractor subcontracts work to unlicensed contractors. In all complaints regarding unlicensed contracting, we attempt to send investigators to the location that same day that the complaint is submitted to the board. The Nscb participates in meeting with consumer groups, homeowner associations, real estate professionals, and senior groups, among others. The board's message consistently promotes the verification of a contractor's license by checking with the Nscb website. To better protect the customers, we also encourage them to verify the scope of the contractor's license, monetary limit, and any past disciplinary measures against the contractor when verifying a contractor's license status. In the past, sting operations have been successful in promoting the board's mission through partnerships with the media. However, over the past years, complications with planning stings has arose, and both challenges from the pandemic and law enforcement's unavailability to assist Nscb efforts. The lack of available support from law enforcement is problematic in circumstances where there is a need for a custodial arrest. To adapt to these limited law enforcement assistance, the board has utilized a strategy of having unlicensed contractors submit bids to investigators at commercial job sites. Bids are encouraged by the investigators to be sent electronically. The contractor is not confronted about his illegal activity until a few days after the meeting at the board, at which time he is confronted about his unlicensed contracting. This adaptive practice has proven to be very, very successful. And I'll be happy to answer any questions you have regarding any unlicensed contracting activity in Nevada.
I have more of a comment. I just want to thank what both your offices do on both sides. You know, it's an important component of what these boards are about. You know, identifying these bad actors and protecting the public from shoddy and work and you know, and financial repercussions also. So thank you and your agents.
Diana?
Thank you. Could you tell me if law enforcement gives any type of explanation to their unwillingness to assist in combating with unlicensed contractors?
It's really limited resources on their part. They've been strained through, obviously, the COVID pandemic. Number of personnel. Law enforcement is not exactly a very prestigious occupation to enter into these days. They're having a very, very difficult time in recruiting, much more difficult than, let's say, maybe 10 years ago. That's one of the reasons. It's really it's the resources that are available. They don't necessarily look at us as being a real top priority with the amount of crime that's out there. And so we've tried a number of ways in order to address that with them through dealing with the senior management at the respective agencies, and we just found that our strategy of not confronting these unlicensed contractors on the job site has worked best. When we've had an issue where we've identified that somebody who is going to be coming to the job site has warrants out for their arrest, we'll contact the local law enforcement, and they'll come and arrest them without a problem. It's just, it's a strain on them for them to dedicate, maybe 2 police officers for 1 or 2 days full-time to us. It makes much more of a strain on their resources. So for that reason, and I'm not just talking, let's say Las Vegas Metro, we're talking municipalities, whether it's Henderson Police Department dealing with Washoe County, or even Nevada Highway Patrol. It's very, very limited resources. As much as they would like to, they just don't have the availability of manpower.
Michael?
Thank you. Quick question. What piqued my interest was I heard something on the online stings. Is that what you were saying? Like being able to try to get an estimate from a contractor and
Right,
then
so,
providing?
that's a good question. What we're finding is that an unlicensed contractor, if you bring them to want them to give you a bid, they'll give you a bid verbally, but they're very hesitant to give you one in writing for obvious reasons, because that's evidence. So our situation with them is, well, if you're not going to give one to us in writing, we encourage them to give us an online bid electronically, which is just as good as evidence as you can find. So once they do that, and then it just gives us the evidence we need in order to file on them.
Is that just like via email or?
Yeah,
Okay.
an email bid, yes.
Another follow-up question. For your department, I believe I heard earlier there was like 40 in the enforcement, or in Nevada as a whole, and maybe 13 in enforcement. Is that correct?
As far as in enforcement personnel, we have 23 personnel in enforcement. As far as criminal investigators, we'll have seven criminal investigators on board staff. And that would include north and south.
And then following up on that, the licensee complaints versus unlicensed complaints, it looks like it's about 50% of.
Actually, 34% of the complaints that come in to the board are for unlicensed contracting. And that would be either contracting without a license or unlawful advertising.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions from the board? Alan?
Thank you. So this is for, I guess, both boards. It seems that there's a couple of websites that are really enabling these unlicensed contractors to reach out to the next homeowner or victim. Is there what happens after we identify these contractors on these websites? Is there any outreach to these websites to try and get them removed? Is there any ability to hold these websites accountable for promoting unlicensed activity? Or is it just end there that we see these contractors keep advertising on these websites and it just continues to be an issue?
Yes, good question. Our past efforts to address some of these websites, whether it's Craigslist or Facebook, was very, very popular in order for advertising. Very, very difficult due to their not wanting to restrict someone from potentially, advertising their work. It's very difficult for us. What we do is once we identify that someone is an unlicensed contractor advertising on a website, we issue, if it's a first-time offense, we issue them a letter advising them what they are doing. It's basically a warning letter advising them what they're doing is against the law. We will issue them a cease and desist. If they continue that, we find it, if they don't take it down, then the next complaint that we receive against them, we will issue an administrative citation. If it continues, we could file criminal charges against them for unlawful advertising. But in the past, we found that the criminal charges for unlawful advertising are not something that the district attorney's offices are enthusiastic about, because there's no victim. Just the advertising. So we find that it's best for us to be able to issue an administrative fine If they don't pay the fine, it'll go to collections, and that's going to hurt their credit report. What's very difficult about the advertising cases, because unless you have a person behind that, that you've identified, it's very difficult we can't charge somebody, or we can't charge, I say, Paul's, plastering for unlawful advertising. We can notify them, and if they continue hopefully they will stop the activity. If we're able to identify who Paul is, then we can then issue the administrative citation to that individual. And if it continues, potentially, as I said, criminal, but as I said, it's not something that it's very welcome within respective district attorney's offices. So.
Any other questions from the board? Steve?
Thank you for all your information. One thing, though, I do know that I was going to state was with the DAs that, unfortunately, with the advertising, there's not a value, there's not an amount. So because of that, they can't, you can advertise all you want, but unless you have an amount that's over the amount where you need a permit, it's hard to go after them. Are you having, so if you're seeing somebody that's advertising, is it based on an amount that they're advertising, or how do you justify that?
Well, the way our statute is, you cannot, even if it's under $1,000 labor and materials, if it requires a permit, or if it's electrical, plumbing, or HVAC, it would be illegal. So even if they're doing that, we are still, unless we have a victim, it's going to be very difficult to get prosecution.
Diana?
Thank you. Just a follow-up question to my original question about seeking help with unlicensed contractors. If it's appropriate, have you thought about going to any other agencies such as the Internal Revenue Service for tax evasion for the unlicensed contractors to get them that way?
Looked at as essentially something that we could look at. I know through the task force that we are involved in, the employment task force or the black market task force, that it is something that we are encouraging participants from other agencies. And I think that's, looking at the IRS would be something that would be potentially beneficial, especially seeing that they've received another 80,000 employees, so coming up. Maybe we'll get one of them, right?
Any other questions from the boards? Any questions or comments from the public? Feel free to go up to the microphone.
Nick Forschetti, National Contractor License Agency. You mentioned that more licensed contractors are using unlicensed contractors, in more cases of that, and wondering if you have any information on why they're using unlicensed contractors. I thought I heard you kind of make a statement about that. But if that's kind of a combination maybe of, you mentioned people are kind of reluctant to come in and get licensed, or is it maybe a language barrier, or you have, an influx of a new population creating any of those issues?
Yeah, this is one of the things that we're seeing as, hopefully this trend will not continue, to the point where we're finding that licensed contractors are entering into business relationships with unlicensed contractors. More and more we're seeing this. And it's not one specific field either. So it's not just painting, it's not framing, it's not pools, it's across the board we're seeing this. And we believe that this has also resulted in the less of the reporting from the industry of unlicensed contracting, which we found that is down in Nevada, in spite of the fact that there's so much work that's being done. One of the reasons, as I stated, is that licensed contractors, as throughout the country, they're having very, very difficult time finding workers, finding subs in order to meet their timelines. Additionally, obviously the costs associated, the rising costs for construction. If you've got a contract, you're trying to limit your reduction of your profit, you're going to potentially look at a lower workforce, a lower price workforce, and that would be unlicensed contractors. Now, the question is it across the board? It's across the board in the sense of a lot of the trades that we're seeing. I don't think it's something where it's rampant, but we're finding this as being more and more cases that we're finding which licensed contractors are actively involved with unlicensed contractors. And it's not only even subbing the work out, but it's also what we would call a licensed loan, or to a point where they are pulling permits for unlicensed contractors for a fee. Whether it's for a pool contract, we had a case where we have a licensed pool contractor for $5,000. He's pulling permits for unlicensed contractors on pools. So that's what we're really finding. I don't think it's a language barrier. I don't think it's a situation where we've got a population that's come into Nevada that wants to work and just don't know how to get licensed. It's a situation where it's the supply and demand. We've got a high demand for labor, and the one source that they can tap into is unlicensed contractors, and that's what we're finding that they're doing.
Any other questions from the public?
Do you require that the guys get licensed? Do you require them to apply to get licensed once you've investigated them?
One of the board's strongest, I think, efforts is to include everybody under the tent. We want to get people licensed. Unlicensed contractors, we welcome them to get licensed. We will work with them to get licensed. And we expend every effort in order to do that. So as like what California does with having the applications, we provide those to unlicensed contractors. We try to walk them through what the process would be. We get them to talk to the licensing side of the board and encourage that. Again, whether it's something they choose to do later on or want to do, some of them we're finding that they are trying to do that now. But it's one of those things where it's, we can only, bring them to the river, we can't make them drink, And I think some of them think that it could be something that it's very, very high hill to climb, whether it's a cultural issue or a language issue, and we try to do the best we can to get them up that hill. So.
Thank you. Just wondering, is this a trend that we're seeing in California also? Licensed contractors using unlicensed subs, or?
Every state, yeah, definitely.
Steve, you want to, yeah, thank you.
I haven't seen it as a trend. It's something that we've come across over the years. When we have a licensed contractor hiring an unlicensed contractor, it's a violation of the law. We charge them, but as a trend, I haven't seen that.
Steve, what happens when you find a licensed contractor using an unlicensed contractor? What do you do with the licensed contractor?
We take a legal action against them in every case. We take a legal action against the licensee and the unlicensed contractor.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any further questions or comments on this, on agenda item 4CA? All right, we'll move in the lead on this one. Thank you very much.
Approximately 50% of our licensed contractors file an exemption, telling us that they do not have employees. And our research and experience shows that that is not even close to reality. Thousands of California consumers are at risk of substantial financial harm if an uninsured employee is injured on their property. Additionally, legitimate contractors are at an unfair advantage. They can't compete with the unlicensed or with the contractors who don't have workers' comp. They can provide a lower bid. CSLB has worked very hard to address this over the years, and we've unfortunately made very little impact. In the last 3 years, we've issued over 1,500 stop orders on projects where we have found employees working who are not covered by workers' comp. In addition to the stop orders, we issue administrative citations or refer the case to the local district attorney. However, getting the district attorneys to file the cases for the workers' comp violation is very challenging. There's a much higher level of evidence required. They actually want to see the identity of the employee. We actually have to be able to identify the employees. So it makes it very challenging. The combined efforts of education and enforcement have not been enough to address the problem, and CSLB is not staffed to audit the 123,000 approximate licensed contractors who are claiming that they do not have employees. Another problem that we encounter is we receive leads often from licensed contractors who see a contractor working with employees and no workers' comp. And we'll do everything we can to send an investigator to wherever that job site is in California. And again, we're talking about 27 investigators in 58 counties. So it's not always possible, but we do everything we can. Often what we find when we get there, the contractor does have a workers' comp policy, but just didn't send it in to us. So that's a violation, and we can address it, but it doesn't prevent the problem of us wasting our resources running all over the state trying to confirm these alleged violations. So enforcement staff are very excited about two current laws that are, one has been passed. Assembly Bill 569 was recently passed, which increases our maximum civil penalty for having employees and no workers' comp from $5,000 to $30,000. And secondly, as Registrar Foat mentioned previously, SB 216, which is currently making its way through the legislature, if passed, will require initially all C8, C20, concrete contractors, C20 HVAC contractors, and D49 tree service contractors to have workers' comp. And then over the next 3 years, that will increase to include all licensed contractors will be required to have a workers' comp policy. And just to comment on that, we did some undercover sting operations in our SWIFT unit over the past few years where we specifically targeted licensed contractors, licensed D49 tree trimming contractors who were exempt from workers' comp and had advertisements with pictures showing multiple employees, and we called them out to the sting operations, and they showed up with employees. Not surprising at all. So that's why those three trades are among the first three in this new bill.